Hello and welcome to A Friend Remembers, a channel where I, through the year of 2023, have been revisiting every JRPG Final Fantasy mainline entry released on modern consoles. The Pixel remasters came out for the first time this year, and I was really happy to go back and revisit the origins of this landmark series. Following the Pixel remasters, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9 and 10 are all available on modern consoles and accessible to you. However, the next game in this marathon, looking at the numbered entries, is the first game in the series that has never been properly re-released on modern consoles. It's still the same fundamental code running it on computer as there was over 20 years ago when it originally came out. And for that reason, I am going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about why you should play Final Fantasy 11. Final Fantasy XI is fundamentally different from all of the previous 10 games I've played. It's an online, massive multiplayer experience. It's one of the first truly successful massive online multiplayer experiences. It predates World of Warcraft, which is arguably the game that made the genre the worldwide phenomenon it is today. But Final Fantasy XI isn't the first. It was heavily inspired by a game called EverQuest. And the producers in Japan at Square of the Final Fantasy series saw that game and they were inspired to say, well, we think the Final Fantasy formula can be translated into this sphere and create something truly special. Well, it clearly is something truly special because it's still going, it's changed, it's not a static entry. This was designed to be something that could be modified and updated, but when they originally conceived it, they only had an idea that it would live for as long as the PlayStation 2 console itself did. The PlayStation 2 and 3 and 4 have all come and gone, but this game's still there, and it's got enough players paying a monthly online subscription to make it worthwhile and sensible for Square Enix to not just keep the servers online, they're still, up to the year of 2023, releasing new content for the game. This is unheard of success. This is phenomenal in any age of digital video gaming. And so it's impossible for me to go back and replay because I never experienced it the first time round. It's impossible for me to look at the game Final Fantasy XI that was originally made. What you can purchase now is a compilation that contains pretty much all of the expansions ever developed for the console, several of which make this game a far more accessible, a far easier entry than it ever was when it first came out. The gameplay loop of Final Fantasy XI is incredibly simple. You are tasked with creating a character. You've got a fairly flexible character creation option given the age in which this was made. You can choose one of 5 races of characters. Almost for all those races, most of those races, you can choose the gender and some appearances of your character and a job class. You are not restricted to only that job class, but the game will encourage you to have one particular job that you excel at. And by and large, these jobs are inspired by the same jobs that would exist in the original Final Fantasy games. You've got a warrior, you've got a thief, you've got a monk, you've got a white mage, a red mage, and a black mage. Each of these jobs have different skills and proficiencies. They mirror and match what was available in the old Super Nintendo and Nintendo Entertainment System Final Fantasy games from back in the 1980s and the very early 1990s. This game harks back right to the very origin of the franchise and asks you to put your character in the shoes of one of those and play through the experience from that solitary perspective. And that is how this game is different. In every other game in the franchise, although there might have been lead characters and specific storylines where you've taken just one character through a certain quest, Final Fantasy has always been about building a party. It's been about leveling a group of characters up to balanced skill sets. It's about equipping jobs to enable your group of people to be able to take on any task that comes at them. But on Final Fantasy XI, it's the most lonely game in the series because you are just one person. You have 2 arms and one set of skills. Eventually, if you play for long enough and level up, you can master a sub-job and you can carry some of these stats and the skills from that sub-job onto your main job, but it will only ever be at half the efficiency of your main job and you have to level it up separately. And leveling up is a mammoth task that you will sink hours and hours and hours into. The number of monsters that you need to kill, the number of missions that you need to complete in order to level up and gain experience and improve your skills as a character, this game embodies the grind of the JRPG play session. But if you enjoy that, if this is an enjoyable experience, that's great. What is the challenge though? When Final Fantasy XI came out, it was an online game and it predated a lot of things such as voice chat. There were no headphones on the PlayStation 2 so you could talk to your friends. Your communication options were limited to a keyboard or impressive for the time communication system of emotes and subtle communication gestures sort of indicate and yell to other players in the vicinity, I want to form a team, I want to form a party. Because although you are just one one person. The world will destroy you if you go out into it unprepared. Final Fantasy XI requires you to build and assemble a party of other players who are playing at the same time as you. You need to balance the skill sets and make sure everyone's equipped and has sufficient techniques to take on the damage in the world outside. And then you venture forth from your home capital city into the wilderness and take on quests and missions, or just grind and kill monsters to build up your stats. There are 3 home cities, so the players will be scattered across these 3 territories, which are split over 2 central continents. And each of those cities has their own plotline and quests that will slowly pull you into the main thrust of the game. But this game is so unlike every other game in the series, it doesn't really push you towards the main plotline very strongly. In fact, I'd been playing for over 6 hours before I realised that the main way to actually advance the quest and move the story forwards, at least the start of the game, you need to talk to the guards every time you enter and leave the city. You need to talk to the guards and they'll tell you what they want you to do, because you're not a hero of ages, you are not someone special. The world of Vana'diel, where Final Fantasy XI is set, is designed so that adventures are a commodity that are really commonplace. There are not many very large standing armies. The way of life is maintained by a steady stream of adventurers setting out and keeping the monster population down, and the cities are hiring these buccaneers, these privateers, these self-made individuals to do small jobs on their behalf, rather than maintaining a large individual army of their own. You are not the chosen one, at least not at the start of the game. You are just another nobody. The guards will treat you as such and say, "Oh, it's nice to see you. Good luck out there," in a jovial comradeship way. You're just another pair of hands that can be put to work. The game does a very poor job at telling you what it expects you to do, because it honestly doesn't care. It just wants you to have fun. It wants you to immerse yourself in this world, in these sets of characters, and set out, and it's up to you to find what you need to do. I was shocked, and I shouldn't have been, because none of the Final Fantasy games have replayed to this point. There are no exclamation marks over characters' heads saying, "I'm important, I've got a mission." There is no marker on a map telling you where all of the missions are. You need to talk to everyone, because you don't know who's got something interesting to say. You don't know who can set you off down a quest line. You don't know what you need to do to progress. Progression is something that just happens naturally by immersing yourself in the world of Vana'diel and doing all of the things that come across you. It was originally designed this way because word of mouth, players would tell each other, "Oh, you need to go here. Oh, you need to go there." The incredible difficulty of the game, the fact that once you pass level 10 and you leave the opening areas, you cannot kill monsters on your own. You will need a party, just as you did in all of the old Final Fantasy games, unless you really over-leveled and entered old areas where you'd been several hours earlier in the game, and then you could dominate monsters in just 1 or 2 hits. Final Fantasy XI is not designed for you to be able to play it solo. At least it wasn't when it came out. In the many years since the original release, there's been all sorts of quality of life features that are designed to make the game more accessible, the major innovation here being the trust system. So now, as a single player, I can summon trusts, which are alter egos and duplicates of characters from the main game, from the main storyline, who you can summon to fight alongside you. You have no control over their actions. They have their own internal programming in the way they will respond to the situation, but they don't really act like actual human players. It's extremely obvious that you're working with limited artificial intelligences responding to the world around them. And worst of all, if you die, they disappear, they won't bring you back. This is a single player experience. You are not controlling a team of people, you are one individual out of your party. But once you've got your head around that mindset, this game reminded me of the Nintendo Entertainment System's original trilogy. Just the way it builds itself, the way it sets itself up, the way it tells you to go out into the world and see what you can find, to talk to everyone you can see, and uncover the quest line with very little drama. The design of the characters and the skill sets that you have. This could be, despite the weird oddities and vulgarities that are required by this being an online game that requires you to connect up with friends or strangers, probably strangers, and put your trust into them playing alongside you and working as a team with people you might never see again. Outside of that weird quirk, this is the most faithful to the original Final Fantasy the series has been in over a decade. This game really reminded me of the core original trilogy Final Fantasy experience in a way that I wasn't expecting. It really took me by surprise. The storyline of Final Fantasy XI, the original game, is incredibly bare bones. You are an adventurer, you will get jobs in your home city to make yourself useful, and eventually you'll be trusted enough for them to put something really important in your hands. It really doesn't matter which of the home cities you start with, there is a lot of beautiful symmetry between those 3 starting positions, both in terms of the types of jobs, they're not exactly the same. The quests are different, but symmetry within the way these areas are laid out. And eventually you will come to Juno, the city in the middle, a neutral state that has relations with all other free nations. And once you've visited all of the nations, once the game has forced you to fully explore this world, and you've met the ambassador of your home nation and been given quests to do in the city of Juno, then the storyline's going to kick into gear. The overall plot is about the resurrection of the Shadow Lord, an emperor who ran the Beastman and led an invasion of monsters against free nations 20 years ago in the Great Crystal War. There's rumours that he's been resurrected, and you are one member of the party who will eventually be sent in to bring him down. But Final Fantasy XI won't drive you towards this. It's up to you to uncover it. The Shadow Lord isn't a pending threat to, once you hear mention of him, he'll keep cropping up again, but he's very much mentioned as a thing you should get to eventually. It would be a good idea if someone did something about it. For anyone familiar with the Final Fantasy games who started with Final Fantasy 7 through to 10, I can imagine this being an incredible culture shock. But as someone who went through Final Fantasies 1 to 3, this is really familiar. The huge difference here, the thing that stuck out to me, is just the scope of the world. Because Vana'diel is vast, but it's not open world. In fact, cards on the table time, I think Vana'diel handles the large interconnected world format far better than a lot of AAA modern open world adventure games today will, because it manages to have its cake and eat it by being incredibly vast, incredibly interconnected, but not have too many areas which are big, open, empty, roaming spaces. And it's a good job that it doesn't, because so much of this game is backtracking. The world of Vana'diel never really gives you a true map. It's very difficult. You've got to memorize how to get from one place to another. But outside of the cities, you will enter a biome, a zone. There will be, you might have to search for it, because once you leave your home area, the map will not automatically generate as you step into a new area. It's up to you to either find through quest lines or simply buy. With the very limited access to Jill at the start of the game, I found it very hard to earn money. It's up to you to buy a map in order to work out where you are, but once you enter a specific map, a specific zone, it will have an ambience. It might be a desert area, it might be a snowy mountain area, it might be a jungle, it might be rolling open plains, but that zone, that specific map will be very specific. It'll have a specific set of monsters, it'll have a specific set of music for you to experience. You'll explore it, you might have to do missions there, you might just want to pass through it on your way somewhere else, but none of these zones are identical. They all offer a very different flavour, and they're all interconnected. You move through these zones, going from place to place, feeling like you're exploring a much larger world than you actually are. They give the impression of depth and distance as you move on from one map to another. And these maps are pretty vast. Some of them are enormous and can take over 5 to 10 minutes to walk from one end to the other, particularly if there's a lot of obstacles in the way. And unless you're over leveled and revisiting an area you've never been into before, every monster you encounter will aggro against you unless you make yourself invisible or silent using sneak. They'll turn on you and they'll attack. I haven't talked about the combat system, which is another thing Final Fantasy XI does very differently. Because you're only controlling one character out of a potentially larger group, the enemies will lock onto you, and you don't automatically lock onto them. You can try and run away, or you can hope that one of your comrades or another player will start targeting the enemy. But it's up to you to manually engage and disengage with each combat. It's actually something I found really annoying, is when you're surrounded by multiple enemies, and when you manage to kill one of them, the game won't automatically move your combat onto another one. You might have to manually and quite awkwardly tab through and find your way to select another enemy and re-engage the combat. This downtime between different enemies I found quite frustrating, but once you have engaged, once an enemy has enmity against you, which means it's attacking you, you select to target it, and then you will slowly attack, with each of your main attacks having a long cooldown before the second one. The goal here is, with each attack you'll be building up a TP gauge, and it's these TP attacks, this sort of limit break systems, where you can embark real lasting damage against the enemy. Or if you're a mage, you can use your range of spells, but you've got to buy the spells or recover them from notorious monsters scattered across the world. So it's going to take a long time to build up your ability skill set and build up your spells to be able to take down those monsters. But your capabilities are extremely limited. Warriors are really good at hitting things, but they have no spell casting power. White mages are great at keeping their health up, but their damage potential against enemies is extremely limited. Black mages can nuke enemies with very powerful darts. dark magic attacks, but they're glass cannons. They've got extremely low HP pool and will die to just a couple of hits. So as a black mage, if you go out in front and get lots of enemies targeting you, you are not going to last very long unless you have another character who can suffer the damage or has a much higher defense stat and HP pool. They need to aggro the enemies to gain the enmity against them, and as the black mage you need to hang back and then use your devastating attacks carefully so the enemies don't reorientate themselves to attack you. This is a wonderful interplaying system if you've got a good group of characters around you, or if you in the modern age rely on the trust system. But it's slow. For someone coming from the previous Final Fantasy games where strategy was everything and you had to be very responsive, it's not that Final Fantasy XI doesn't demand that you're responsive. You can be, and you have to be very aware to things like status effects such as poison. You have to be very aware of what characters different enemies are targeting, who is on low health, and where you need to position yourself. Particularly the thief characters, positioning is absolutely vital for what they're going to need in order to get the most of their playstyle. Walking from one zone, from one map to another map and seeing what's out there, of testing my fingers, tentatively exploring and checking different enemies. And you do have to do that throughout the game. Just because you're competent against most of the enemies in a particular map, there will be notorious or apex monsters scattered liberally. Some of them will not look any different to the other monsters, and if you target them, they're not going to let up. They will decimate your party. And the most frustrating thing about this game is once a monster's targeted you, there's almost nothing you can do to flee and run away from them. They will chase you to the other ends of the map if they have to. This game demands caution, and it has repercussions for failure more than almost any other game I've ever seen. In the original version of the game, once you were past level 30, if you died, you'd lose experience. You could actually level down and lose access to certain equipment and spells that you were reliant upon. Modern iterations have toned down the loss there. Venturing into new areas is not as risky an endeavour now as it used to be, but there's still some danger there. There's still a long trek. If you die in a remote area, it's going to take you a long time, upwards of 10 to 15 minutes, to make your way back there to take on that fight again. It's a scary experience. Despite it being almost impossible to communicate, communication is everything in this game. And I can see why it built up such a loyal following, because the people who get into it, once they're over that incredibly hard orientation barrier of actually just understanding what's going on, understanding the systems, there's a lot to love here. But the combat is slow. The cooldowns between attacks is mind-numbing, and so many enemies have really high health pools. An individual battle can last several minutes, with hardly any HP being lost from either side, if a good team knows what they're doing. I've watched online videos of some of the most difficult boss battles, and for someone not orientated or understood in the lore and the background system, Final Fantasy XI can be completely incomprehensible if you don't know what's going on. Which is why the start of the game, I think, is so slowly paced. It wants you to ease yourself in, it wants you to immerse yourself in the world of Vana'diel, before eventually you've built up enough renown for them to say to you, it's time to take on the Shadow Lord. And that's the end of the original game. There is a deep storyline here. There's a backstory to where the Shadow Lord's come from and why he's come back. But it takes a long time to uncover that. Where I think the game does begin to really evolve into more than it originally was, though, are the various expansions. Having just paid for a couple of months of playtime as part of this marathon to discover the game, there was no way I was going to be able to explore or complete all of the expansions. But I have seen most of the content in the original two, Rise of the Zilart and Chains of Promethea, and they are fantastic experiences. Rise of the Zilart takes the core gameplay loop from the original game, adds a few more job options, and gives you several new interconnected areas which are incredibly deep and labyrinthian. This game is almost impossible to play without either someone playing alongside you who's done it all before and can act as a mentor or a guide, or using the wiki. There are no guides, there are no instructions, there is nothing pushing you towards completing these tasks. Without someone who has been told secondhand the information before, exploring this world, or access to the community resources of the Wikipedia page, this would be impossible. For a game that charges you on a month-by-month basis, this is interminable. But using a Wikipedia guide to tell you what to do, you're just going through the motions. Fortunately, the storyline really picks up from Rise of the Zilart. It actually presents you some very engaging enemies and a clear threat that actually points towards the end of the world if you don't overcome it. This is then expanded on even more in the next expansion, Chains of Promethea, where the level design is much more linear. It still takes you to brand new biomes, new zones, new exciting areas, but the cutscenes are much deeper and it gives you a much larger cast of characters, all with their own aims and ultimate goals and objectives that you need to navigate your way around. These first 2 expansions were planned out when the game was originally released in Japan, so I can probably say that the original 3, the core game Rise of Zilla and Chains of Promethea, would constitute the core Final Fantasy XI experience, which if you enjoy, I then heartily recommend from what I've seen, looking at the follow-on expansions that take you to whole new areas and whole new gameplay styles. Unfortunately for this retrospective, there just wasn't time to go and engage in them myself. But this has been a discovery, this has been a fantastically interesting experience, because I dismissed Final Fantasy XI when it came out. I didn't have a PlayStation 2 or a computer powerful enough to handle it. Even if I had, I didn't have any interest in paying a monthly subscription fee for one game, for something that was slowly dropping new content over months and years. But here in 2023, the game is complete. The biggest barrier to it is the awful play online system, where you need to register multiple different accounts with multiple different Square Enix systems, some of them that don't talk to each other very intelligently. Just running the game and getting it installed on your computer in a way that will enable you to lock in and load your character is a quest and a half. I can't work out what I make of the main game though. It's fun. It's engaging. When you know what you're doing and you've got a clear goal ahead of you and someone playing alongside you who also shares that goal, it's a brilliant experience. Even when you're doing it solo, the trust system now make it accessible. You're no longer at the beholden whims of the wider world, and I think there are some core players out there who actually miss those older days. But I think bringing more players into the world and getting it available to them is worth it. And I still had some success on some missions when I was just stuck and my character was just too vulnerable, where someone actually who was doing the same mission at the same time I ran into and I said, can we do this together? Can you give me a hand? They carried me through to the end of that mission, and then they said, look, is there anything else you want a hand with? Is there anything else I can do for you? And unfortunately at that point in the game, no, it really was just this one mission I was stuck on. But that was a really fun experience that you can only get from online gaming. But would I pay a monthly subscription for several years to access this? No, because it's also an incredibly frustrating experience where you often don't know what you're doing unless there's a guide sat at the computer next to you, so you can rapidly consult back and forth between what you're meant to be doing and what items you need to have in your inventory that you might not know about. Games are not designed like this anymore. There's nothing produced in the last 5 years anywhere near as inscrutable, as uncertain as Final Fantasy XI. It's deliberately opaque. It doesn't want you to have an easy time of it. It wants you to immerse yourself and feel like you've got a true sense of accomplishment. So when you do actually beat the Shadow Lord, that was something amazing. That was something very few people are capable of doing, but you did it. I think the world of Vana'diel is a fantastic creation, and the storylines that I got to dip my toe into, particularly the expansions more than the main game. Once Final Fantasy XI picks itself up, it's building to something incredible, but the time commitment it asks of you, the amount of backtracking, the amount of repetitive gameplay, the amount of opaqueness and uncertainty, I'm not certain it's worth it, and it's not something I personally could put hours and hours of my life into. But I can completely now, 2 decades after looking at this game from afar and saying it feels like the black sheep of the family. It's the most overlooked game in the Final Fantasy series and the least accessible, having not been ported or remade for mobile or modern consoles. It's still fundamentally old code. I can see why it survived for 2 decades. I can see why it was so popular in its heyday, and it's still having a resurgence now. It's never been more accessible. It's never been easier to pick up a party of your own that, although you don't have much control over, at least you've got the reliability of a safety net that you're not forced to engage in the online multiplayer, which is, I think, great for encouraging you to pick up and start the game, but it does lose something from the social experiments that Final Fantasy developers are engaging in. You can never get that true original experience. It was very much of its time of the mid-2000s. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. That doesn't mean it's not worth dipping your toe into. And with the understanding of the potential time sink and the understanding of what's going to be in store for you, I've seen very few games that gave me such a sense of purpose, a sense of discovery, a sense of immersion. And that, I think, is why the people who love this game absolutely adore it. As quaint, as archaic, as old as the playstyle is. It takes me back to a very different gaming era. And I'm so happy to see that it's still popular, that you will still constantly see people running around the servers, doing their own thing. It's not a completely solo experience. And because I know I won't get to Final Fantasy XIV in the year of 2023, I have put several months into playing it, but there's no room in the schedule for me to produce and edit and make that video before the new year. It's a very different beast from the MMO that would come to follow it. The two of them play extremely differently, and I'll get to the differences when I come to that video next year in the year of 2024. So for anyone out there who wants to know what the best game to pick up after enjoying the original Nintendo Entertainment System and Final Fantasy games, this is one of the most faithful recreations. For anyone who enjoyed Final Fantasy XIV and would like to dip their toe into the retro experience and see what the original online Vana'diel playstyle was like, it's still worth experiencing. It just bugs me that having paid to purchase a game, I only got to experience it for a month before it then became inaccessible and there was no content. And that's just something I, as someone who traditionally plays offline single-player games, can't get my head around. Even 2 decades later, it bugged me back in the mid-2000s and was one of the main reasons I never picked up the game then. I finally purchased it now and my subscriptions ran out. This is now dead software, unless I open my credit card up again. And that bothers me on a deep internal level that I can't quite put voice to. So I won't be playing this game again in the near future, but I'm so happy that I did get to experience. I'm so happy that I dipped my toe in. And for a short while at least, my character will be there on the server. I can reactivate her, I can pick up where I left off. I can go and see what was left in Vana'diel and the secrets left uncovered. It's such a massive game. There are so many quests and missions, and the storyline looked like it was getting so good when my time ran out. I can think of dozens of reasons why you should play Final Fantasy XI if you've got the patience, the time and the budget.